There are four, and then the verse says, the text says, or it implies, there are four differences between original happiness and what? And reflected happiness. And we need to know the difference. When people claim they're enlightened, what they're claiming is that, in general, they're not claiming that they're the original. They think they're claiming that they're original, but what they're actually claiming is what? Is the reflected. In other words, they've experienced the reflection of awareness in a purely sattvic mind, and they think that the experience is moksha. So they define, that's how moksha is defined for them. And they don't know their experience. They're ignorant of the original. They think that the reflection is the original. Therefore what? Therefore we need to distinguish the original from the reflection. So what is the difference between the original happiness, the original fullness and completeness, and the experience of deep sleep, or reflected happiness? One, reflected happiness belongs to the bliss sheath. Okay, that's the happiness is inherent in the bliss sheath, just like fears and desires. Where do your fears and desires belong? What do they belong to? The subtle body. If you remember Atma Bodh and the other basic texts, three gunas texts, etc., etc. All of them say that what? None of those fears and desires belong with the original. They all belong with the subtle body. So by not identifying with the subtle body, you what? You forego your identification with what? Your fears and your desires. And original happiness belongs to the self. So, and original happiness is just the what? The self-confident fullness of what? Knowing that you are the self. It's not a particular, and that particular original happiness is present when the reflection is not producing happiness. The reflection, the problem with he's going to say in a minute here, what's the problem with the reflection? Yeah, it fluctuates. Owing to what?
Yes.
Huh?
Rajas.
Yeah, and two more.
And Tamas.
Tamas, yeah, Rajas and Tamas. And what? And relative proportion of sattva. Sometimes sattva is somewhat contaminated with Rajas and Tamas. So your experience of bliss is sometimes more intense and sometimes less intense. So that's the texts call it Priya, Moda, and Pramoda, just to point out that bliss is a relative condition. That reflected bliss is relative. Priya is when you have a pleasant thought. You have a nice thought, arises in the sattva, and you feel a little blip of bliss, like, for instance, Kentucky Fried Chicken.
Oh yeah.
Right? There's a little bit of bliss there. And then you're walking down the street, and you go past the Colonel, and that nice smell, that lovely smell, comes wafting out. Then what? That's called moda. Your bliss is intensified, isn't it? Because you have not just a thought now, your senses are involved. You smell it, and you look in the window and you see the big bucket there, and that Coke, and those lovely mashed potatoes, and that little puddle of gravy in there, and you're feeling so much happier. And then you walk in, you plunk down your $6, and you sit down at one of those Formica tables, and you ingest that, you take your drumstick and you bite into it, and then that's called promo. Intense. You've assimilated the bliss. Right? You totally experienced it. So bliss comes in stages, in phases, because what? Because the causal body is subject to fluctuation. everything in the Maya world is subject to fluctuation. So therefore, what reflected happiness comes and goes. Original happiness is you're okay when something ugly or nasty is happening. It doesn't matter what you're experiencing if you're the self. If you're the self, bad stuff is bad stuff and good stuff is good stuff, and it has nothing to do with you. So your sense of yourself is completely unaffected by whatever you're experiencing, good or bad. That's if that's your experience, then you're what? Then you are original, the original pure consciousness, or the original pure existence consciousness. At that moment, you're what? Totally identified or one with that. And original happiness is what? That's permanent. So, and then what? Reflected, and we said it's reflected as happiness. And for reflected happiness is what? Objectified happiness, and it can be experienced, but original happiness cannot be experienced as an object by a finite entity. That's where all the neos and these modern people go wrong. They're promising, they're telling you that that finite entity that you are is supposed to experience that limitless, full, existential happiness of the self, that original. And the scripture here in Vedanta is very clear that the self cannot be objectified. Only the experience of bliss can be objectified. And it is objectified throughout the day. In fact, when you get what you want, you go to the causal body. When you get what you want and your mind stops for a minute, you get the deep sleep aspect of the waking state. You're in the waking state, but what? When you get what you want, your mind shuts, your thoughts and your desires disappear, and you feel good. And the feel good means that what? You have temporarily become one with yourself. So, and what about this? What about this causal body? It's the Lord of all. It is omniscient. It knows everything. It is the inner controller and the place where all beings originate and dissolve. Okay, what Lord of all means what? What is the fundamental motivation for every action? Happiness, yeah. Fred, you get a gold star today, you're doing good. Yeah, happiness. So happiness is the Lord, isn't it? Happiness is what's controlling you. God or the Lord is what you depend upon, that controls you, doesn't it? Isn't it? Is anybody here looking for misery? Is anybody here motivated by the search for misery? Huh? Answer, no. No one is. Misery or suffering is not the Lord. It's not, it doesn't dominate your mind and force you to seek it. Happiness is what? Is the experience of your own true nature, and therefore what? And therefore you, everybody seeks it. Huh? Why? Because it makes me happy. Because it removes my sense of incompleteness. We know, see, we know that everybody wants happiness or freedom. That's why Vedanta is an easy sell for a mature person. Because we know where the original happiness, the original unending, unborn happiness is, and what it is, and how to access it. We know that. So once you get mature enough to get over the idea that the reflected happiness is what is happiness, then Vedanta is a pretty straightforward and simple path for you. But as long as you're what? Still looking for the reflection, in other words, trying to squeeze a little bit of joy out of the objects, then you're stuck in samsara, and you're going to be disappointed as much as you're happy, probably more. Who knows? And it is omniscient means what?